各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看 J 与 J 论坛。今天是2020的最后一天了，今天是除夕夜，很开心的有我跟我们的老朋友 金诺威一起来跟大家报个平安，好过跨这个年。Jim, last night of 2020.
Good evening and Happy New Year 2021.
Can't wait for this year to start.
Yeah.
我们真的是很经历了这个多灾多难的一年。It's been a very eventful year. A lot of people will sit here like we discussed earlier. We could talk about what happened this year, which we know. More importantly is what we talk about. What are our hopes and dreams and wishes and our what we hope for next year in 2021. So Jim, you want to tell our audience a little bit? 告诉我们观众你这个对今年的回顾以及对明年的展望。Reflect on this year and perhaps share what you hope for next year.
Yeah. I think this year, everybody has their own view of the difficulty that we've all experienced, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I think there have been three big uncertainties. One is the uncertainty over the virus itself, how it worked, who was going to be harmed, what the future of it held. Number two, the uncertainty of the economic repercussions that came from that, all of the shutdowns, the economic difficulties and pain. And then number three, politics. Politics certainly dominated the second half of 2020 here in the United States, and I think it had its ripple effects across the world as well. So the first thing that I hope for is clarity on each of those three things. I hope regarding the coronavirus that the vaccines become plentiful, widely distributed, widely taken, and widely successful. I also hope that our scientific community learns from the experience everywhere, and we learn from each other. This is a topic that we've spoken about many times. We in the United States sometimes have an arrogant attitude about things, but I think there's much we can learn from the rest of the world, and I think there's much we can learn by a lot of introspection of what's gone wrong. So that's what I hope. The second thing, I hope we pull out of our economic doldrums. We figure out how to coexist economically with the virus, not do one size fits all, but be a lot smarter about how we deal with things, both to restore the economics itself, but the credibility of our leadership, which is another unfortunate consequence. People simply don't believe our leaders anymore, and that needs to be restored. And then third, I think following that, our political leadership needs to clarify things, regain its credibility, and work to unite us. Again, not just in the United States, but to try to bring ourselves together around the world and understand that people are very similar around the world, despite cultural, ethnic, all the other differences we may talk about, see about. Human nature is the same all around the world. What do most people want? Safety and security, a robust future for themselves and their families, and to look forward to better times with hope and optimism and the power to achieve success. And as long as we understand that, we should learn how to treat people and each other civilly with respect. It isn't very hard to do. It doesn't cost anything to provide a smile, to say please, to say thank you, and to pay somebody a compliment. One of my good friends told me one time, most people would rather die of an overdose of excessive compliments than they would from constructive criticism, than to be saved by constructive criticism. And if we just realize how important it is for people to feel good about themselves and their family's future, we would go a long way to make our world a better place. So you've been patient in listening to me, but those are my thoughts for next year.
Jim, I could sit here and listen to you for hours. These are words of wisdom. These are from your years of experience in life, your empathy, your compassion, your generosity to share with us, to share with me. It's been a privilege, and it was an honor to be able to speak with you and to share our thoughts. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that you could take time out of, both of us, to take time out of our schedules to sit here and talk about things and bring a different perspective to issues that affects, like you said, everyone in the world. We're all the same. We have so many similarities. Yeah. Would you allow me 1 minute to tell our audience these very inspirational words? Could I put any better? 我们好朋友 Jim 啊，他这个非常感性的回顾了这一年，也为了未来的这一年的这个前景与展望。对于回顾的话 ，Jim 提到这3点重要的，一就是个疫情，这个 virus 的问题；第二就是这个对于经济上的伤害，跟怎么样让这个经济来恢复；第三就是这个美国的政治撕裂的这个群族与这个社会，要怎么样能够在政治上找回平衡点。那他对未来的这个展望，明年2021年 2021 是希望说，对这3件重大的事情都有更清晰、更解决的方式，然后就要看到这个对于经济上，要怎么样能够在这个疫情后怎么样能够不能说像以前一样用同一种方式去套在去解决一个问题，而有不同多元化的方式。还要怎么样让这个对我们普通人、对这个政客、对政府捡回这个信心？全世界对美国的这个系统都发生了很大的疑问。这里面提到了这个我们全世界各地的观众啊，不同的体系、不同的国家、不同的种族，但是最终我们有很多很多的共同点。我们最终人类这个世界大同啊、和平，我们人类最基本需要的、苛求的是一样的。我们只希望我们的家人、朋友们能够安全，我们对未来要有希望，然后对我们的家人，希望他们能够好好的过日子。这是人性的这个最基本的渴求，需要。希望我们明年大家都能心想事成，达到各自的愿望。也希望我们这个疫苗能够达到最大的功效，也能够成功的控制这个疫情。Wow, I went ahead and we don't rehearse ever, so I think I was able to express what you said in probably the most on point ever, as clear as I could, as close to originally what you meant as I could. You know, Jim, speaking of next year, speaking of the purpose of our show, like you said earlier, a lot of times is we want to know what our audience are thinking. We want to know where they're from and where they're coming from. So on our last episode, the Christmas episode, the main point, you know, when we talk, always something comes up that actually piques our interest. I wanted to talk about your experience last week and who you admire. And one of the people that you admire just happened to be Mr. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, we had a lot of audience response on the Singaporean method, the Singaporean model. Mm-hmm. Like I said, having lived in Singapore, I could claim that I'm part Singaporean, having many friends and family there. Mm-hmm. I've heard the good and the bad because I could, right? Like me and you, we could criticize Texas, DC, all we want. But when somebody else, let's say somebody from Russia, you know, start criticizing our country, of course you're defensive, right? Is nature. Now, however, last week, we both could agree on one thing. Mm-hmm. It's that Lee Kuan Yew's success is not judged by what he did then. A lot of criticism. But now, 30 years later, 40 years later, we can see the results. History is not immediate. You do not judge immediately to see results. Like I said again, compared to the four little dragons, Singapore, Korea, I look at Singapore as a model. And for Chinese Americans, for all Chinese around the world, ethnicity-wise, for most Asians, Singapore is a haven. Singapore is something that we would almost say a model that people immigrate to. Yeah, yeah. So the criticism at that time of being a dictator, being an authoritarian state, or not having so-called human rights, because in Western nations, we always keep repeating this human rights. But we see the failures of a lot of countries that was westernized or went through when they're not ready, perhaps, for the fully democratic process. Mm-hmm. Singapore was able to do it slowly, but using scaled it, and very importantly, using a economic model. Their economic policies were ahead of its time, knowing their deficiencies. Mm-hmm. What would you say? Would you predict? Do you see maybe China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore and these Chinese majority countries able to get there within our lifetime? 我们能不能看到新加坡这个模式？对不起 ，I'm sorry, Jim. Let me quickly let our audience know. 新加坡的模式，我们上一集讲到，因为我算半个新加坡人，我们在新加坡，我们自己人讲新加坡的时候，当然会有评级，但是也有赞美。但是有外人来说的时候，人性很自然的就会很防御性的，就外人来指责。但是我跟 Jim 可以同意这一点，就是新加坡是一个别的在发展中的国家，尤其亚裔，尤其我们华裔多的国家，是我们希望能看到的。李光耀先生所作的所为，在当时所受到的评级是不公平的，因为事实证明了他所做的是造福了后代，也把这个新加坡的根基打得很深，打得很稳，这是值得赞扬的。那我们现在在讲说，在别的华人的世界有没有办法能够慢慢的达到像新加坡这个模式的平衡，就是有一个程度的自由，但是有非常深厚的经济的底气，但是同样的也能够在这个全世界都能够互相的交流跟投资。So do you think that we have a chance to see other Chinese-dominated countries become Singapore?
I mean, to become like Singapore. If you mean economic success, well, definitely. I think much of Chinese Asia has already demonstrated that. Much of the rest of Asia, Korea, Thailand, some of the other places, even belatedly the Philippines, certainly Japan, a little bit less so now, but over the last 50 years, all of Asia, not all, but nearly all of Asia has done extraordinarily well in the last 40 or 50 years. When it comes to things like human rights and democratic freedom, then I think it depends on the country. I think you were talking about the four tigers. Three of the four tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, are Chinese. And the fourth is Korea. It's not very far apart. It's not Chinese, but geographically.
Ethnicity-wise, Koreans are descendants of Chinese from Shandong.
Yeah, I mean, you can understand it geographically, ethnically, all those other kinds of things. Then I think they've done extraordinarily well. I happen to believe that the history of the last 200 to 300 years, democratic capitalism is the best economic model, the best human rights model, the best model for personal as well as aggregate success. And I think both of those terms have to work together. Democratic capitalism. You can have one without the other, but when you put them together, 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 or 5. That's what you call synergy. I look at the People's Republic of China. At some point, the economic model will have to transform itself into a gradual loosening of the top-down central control of the CCP and really transition to a democratic model. When will that happen? I cannot predict. I hope it happens sooner than later, and I strongly suspect many Chinese citizens hope it happens sooner than later. And I know the people in Taiwan hope, and the people in Hong Kong hope that it happens sooner than later. I think there will be a limit to the success that the CCP and the PRC actually enjoy. But I am a dedicated capitalist. So
I didn't mean to bring this topic here. This is a very sensitive subject, and there's a major points of contention. How should I say it? Yeah, how should I say this? From me and from our perspective, Western media, English language, being in the United States, being educated here, our views are somewhat biased. There are a few things you said that I've said the same, but I've experienced a lot of resistance and a lot of criticism. For example, when you say people in Taiwan or Hong Kong and China are hoping for so-called 民主 democratic process. Mm-hmm. And the reality is not quite. They've done a lot of research. The majority of Hong Kongers do not wish for that. Majority supports their country, which is the People's Republic of China. The majority of people in Hong Kong believes in the rule of law and order. You cannot have both. You cannot have the cake and eat it too. We cannot say we want to have a democratic process, but yet allow rioters. But yet we should riot. We should protest like BLM. But yet we do not respect law. We do not respect sovereignty. So it's very hard. In China, for sure, the support for CCP is at an all-time high. Whatever hope and dreams, the little bit of imagination that people in China still have for our model of so-called democratic capitalism, that ship has long sailed, especially in the last 4 years. Seeing what Mr. Trump has done. When you talk about credibility earlier about trust, we became a joke and a farce, not just to China, not just to Asia, but also to Europe. So when you talk about 这个资本主义，这个自由派的资本主义, does it need to have both? Could it be a capitalism in Singapore's way or in China's way without so-called Western democracy? Because when we use the word CCP, the fact that we use the word communist immediately brings us back to the long-held bias. And some of it is very, very warranted. The Great Purge, the Cultural Revolution, or Soviet USSR, and I mean, for the last 70 years, since World War II, we hold a very negative view. But to Chinese people, to some Singaporeans, to Hong Kongers, to even some Taiwan, Republic of China citizens, CCP, this Communist Party is not the same Communist Party. And very importantly, it's hard to separate the two now. Me and you, we want China to do well. We want Chinese citizens to enjoy a certain level of freedom, to enjoy success. But we want to do it by cutting out CCP. But for most, CCP and China is one. Does that make sense? What I'm saying, does that make sense that they're tied together now? So any criticism towards CCP becomes criticism toward China and its people. It's very hard to separate now. Just like the left or the right here, right? When we see an issue, instead of discussing the issue, it becomes immediately political, left or right. Same thing with China. Any criticism of China becomes automatically that you are this or that. Of course, immediately, if you say anything that are supportive of the regime, you immediately becomes McCarthyism, where you're a sympathizer. And this is happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan and a lot of countries that are in Asia that are closer to the epicenter, to the more susceptible to the influence of China. So when we talk about these questions, there's no way we could appease all our audience because there are 100 different kind of Chinese. Ones that grew up here, ones that grew up in China, that ones in China. Even the same Chinese came from the same country like Taiwan. There are so many different local views and their own definition of history. The one thing I agree with you is that history is black and white. We say history is written by the winners, no doubt. But when I look at history, I don't just look at it from one side. When I look at the history of World War II, if you want to get the whole picture, you will look at books and research done by the opposition and by, let's say, United States. Let's say on the Western European theater, you wouldn't just look at the history written by the Brits. You will look at what the U.S. wrote, what USSR wrote, what German historians wrote. You will look at all of them to get a fair view. Mm-hmm. How do we do that when we sit there and talk about China, which is just, what's going on right now? China will affect us whether we like it or not. I don't know where I'm going with this, Jim. You know what I mean? It's because end of the year, we talk about this because of the fact the last episode, we have a lot of audience in Singapore that reflected on it. Do we really believe, for example, did you know that China last week was able to land their satellite on the moon? Mm-hmm. First time ever. And they caught up. And the entire team that worked on it, average age was 32 years old. Mm-hmm. Aeroscience engineers. They're young, they're coming up, and their ideology is strong. So how do we separate CCP and China, or do we need to separate them? I guess that's what we're talking about.
Well, I don't know. I have really no desire to influence China. They're doing, Chinese in China are doing what they deem is correct. It works for them. How could anybody deny the progress over the latter half of the 20th century and so far in this century? It's worked. I just happen to think long term that actually there are three pieces: democratic capitalism and freedom of religion. For me, it's Christianity and the activity that goes along with Christianity. My favorite book of all time was written by a Catholic theologian, and it was called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. And it starts out by saying 1776 was a very, very important year. It was when the Declaration of Independence in the United States was written, and it was when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, basically articulating the economic system that is capitalism. You put the two of them together, historical coincidence maybe, but that set off the economic boom in Europe and of course in North America at the same time. So I think a lot of different people can get there in different ways, whatever their goals are. Your point about the feelings of the people in Hong Kong and Taiwan wanting the rule of law, things like that, there's no question about that. I would argue that they've had the rule of law under their own democracy over time, and what they may be expressing as a preference for the CCP may be concern about the imminent threat if they disrupt the stability of the CCP and the PRC effectively taking over their countries. So I wonder if you're getting an absolute true result on those polls. I honestly, I would doubt it.
We could delve a lot deeper, perhaps in the future regarding this, but I can tell you right now, there are certain things that, being ethnic Chinese, I'm American, but I'm both. I'm one of the rare that I could really get to. And by the way, I give all the glory to God. I don't like to talk about my faith on my TV shows, but I don't need to hide it. God is our Savior. Without him, there is nothing. Yeah. But once we bring that up, because you talked about 宗教自由, freedom of religion in China and hoping in the future. And then you brought up a few things, for example, Hong Kong, or, the psyche and the baggage of ethnic Chinese people is very long and deep, because Hong Kong never was independent. Hong Kong, Taiwan, they were all lost when the Western powers invaded China using the Opium Wars to force Chinese people to be druggies. When the Qing dynasty refused, they waged war, and then they signed unfair treaties to basically held Hong Kong hostage for many years. Taiwan was to Japan, etc., Shanghai. This is one generation ago. Mm-hmm. So the fear and the doubt and the shame is not gone. So to say that Hong Kong preferred this and that, no, they went back to the motherland. They went back as they should have. Now, the way I look at it is, no matter who is ruling China, China is still China. Hong Kong belongs to China. Taiwan belongs to China. You might be an anti-communist, but they historically, I cannot sit here and say Texas should be independent because we're a conservative red state. Washington, D.C., they're liberals. No, Texas has always been the union. We cannot say we're independent. We might not like it. We're going to have to deal with it. We cannot sit here and say as Texans, hey, Mexico, no, you know what, Mexico probably can't help. China and Russia is funding us. They're sending their CIA agents into the state of Texas to spread the word of independence, to fight against Washington, D.C., to make sure these other 49 states do not force us into submission, because we have a right to be independent. That's what we're doing in Taiwan and Hong Kong. We're telling them, hey, you're independent. You have the rule of law, you're democracy. In a way, I get it. Our State Department has our agenda. United States, we have to exert influence. Taiwan's a pawn, Hong Kong's a pawn. We have bases in the Philippines, Japan. I get it. After World War II, I mean, this is how we became the greatest nation after World War II. But don't use democracy or to give people freedom as an excuse. Hong Kong, Taiwan belongs to China. It always has belonged to China. The government in Taiwan lost the war to communists. It was a civil war and escaped to Taiwan, hoping to go back. It never did. 70 years later, it evolved into a direct vote democracy. But the Constitution is still one China. This is why I believe the next powder keg. When you talk about economics, virus, politics, I think it will all come together. The next hotspot will be issues between China and Taiwan, or China and US. It will involve China. It will involve the Far East. And it's a cycle, right? And, throughout history, the past few centuries, this has been going back and forth. So we have to deal with it. We have to recognize where Chinese people are coming from. Just like when I brought up Singapore. We're not Singaporean. We cannot sit here and say Lee Kuan Yew did this and that. Or, as a Westerner, he did not give people their freedom, or he was opaque, and it was 专制, there was no process of law. Because people that live there benefited from his policies. Their families have hope. Everything you said, have hope for the future, they have safety, for world peace. They achieved that. And whichever way that Lee Kuan Yew used, they got there. Mm-hmm. So what is for us to say that the government of Taiwan right now, or Beijing, is not using their way to achieve the same thing for their people? For us to sit here and use our ideology to enforce it on other countries. I'm sorry, Jim, I just can't. This is what I'm saying may not represent what most ethnic Chinese around the world will say. It will not. I'm just telling you what a lot of others think. Mm-hmm. That a strong China is prideful. It brings pride. It's like Israelis, okay? Jewish people all around the world, mm-hmm. Jewish people in America are still very patriotic and very strongly supportive of Israel because of the history, because of the burden, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Chinese people have the same, but yet China and Chinese people are viewed in a very negative way compared to what Jewish people and Israel is viewed. I'm talking about now. I'm not about 70 years ago when Jewish people are being exterminated. We're not talking about the disgrace, the termination of the race. Not about now. Jewish people are respected. And they should be. Israel is respected. Why is China and Chinese people not afforded the same? Because they went through the same trauma. Their country was broken up, invaded. Japan invaded. U.S. helped. The race of China, Chinese race was close to extermination. Maybe 10% of China was still under Chinese rule. The KMT rule during World War II. Japan has invaded.
Yeah.
If not Pearl Harbor didn't happen, U.S. didn't join in, we were not allies, there will be no such thing as Chinese people because Japan would have took over and exterminated the race, which is their goal. And that's what Germans would have done to the Jewish people. So why is history so, well, I know why. I can tell you why, but it will take forever. So my point is the burden, shame, the history, is very hard to use our current set viewpoint to tie it into this narrative about democracy, about democratic capitalism, when there's so much more going on in Asia and China. There's Chinese people all over Asia. I don't know if you knew that, except for Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia. The top 1% of their population are all ethnic Chinese.
No, that's quite a bit of time in Indonesia. I'm very aware of that. The leaders.
We can talk about Indonesia later because my better half's family's from Indonesia. We need to talk. I need to know more about Indonesia from you. But the point, why I say that is because Chinese people had to escape tyranny or poverty from China for hundreds of years. But no matter where they go, they maintain their culture, they maintain their family tie, they still speak the language, eat the same food. They may change their last name, but everyone in Indonesia knows they're Chinese. Everyone in Thailand knows they're Chinese.
What you're saying is the Chinese culture and identity is stronger historically and into the future than any current form of government. And it is a stronger and uniting force of all the Chinese people throughout the world. And I understand that perfectly. Say it, and your comparison to Jewish people is the same thing. And the Jewish people are also not only an ethnicity, but they're also a religion. And that religion is probably the definition of their identity, probably more so than anything.
Judaism. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, I think everybody has to do it in their own way. And look, the model of government that Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and now President Xi have used has been extraordinarily successful by any measure. And I think the average Chinese person living in mainland China would say today they have more freedom than anyone in their recent history, recent centuries, and they've earned it. At the same time, I think they respect and are grateful to the United States for many things that have occurred, from the flying tigers that helped liberate China from Japan to...
No, they do not feel gratitude. Remember, that help was granted to the regime that the CCP overthrew. That China went to Taiwan. Does that make sense?
Okay.
The China that fought the war together went to Taiwan. The Communist Party did not fight against Japan. They came into power during the war because they were not taken care of.
Okay.
That's the shame. That's the shame. Because being revisionist doesn't help. But the fact is, if Communist Party did not happen, it would not take China this long. China would have been Chinese century, last century. Mm-hmm. The founding of New China, Sun Zhongshan Jinsen, Sun Yat-sen, Mr. Sun Yat-sen, said it 100 years ago, that this next century will be the Chinese century. He was right. He was just a little bit too early. Mm-hmm. But Communist Party happened. If they did not happen, if the KMT government that was in Taiwan now, which they also lost power, if they stayed in China, which they were heavily influenced by the United States, mm-hmm. would we see something that would happen like Australia or perhaps the United States a few 100 years ago? Well, we don't know. But we know that China was going to come up no matter what regime was in power. The fact is, Communist Party did hold back China for a good 30 years, from their purge, the Great Purge, to to the Cultural Revolution from 1949 to the early 80s. More people died in China than World War I and World War II combined. How we look at North Korea now is how we looked at China then. Think about how fast they've, so everything you said about China, I'm giving you the other point of view where we have to hold it accountable because history repeats by itself and we don't recognize it. Mm-hmm. So what you said about U.S. help to China was a different regime. However, up until 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, it's a soft power. The might of the United States is not just in our military power. Mm-hmm. It's our entertainment, it's our pop culture, it's our music, it's Coca-Cola, it's McDonald's.
Well, yeah, it's culture.
Soft power.
It's culture and the educational system, technology, and all the advances that flow from that.
Years ago, the top students from all over the world will come to U.S. They will stay here when they graduate and contribute to this great country. Mm-hmm. The last few decades, things have changed. They will come, learn what they can, and go back to their countries. And this is not just China.
No, India's very similar. Latin American countries, European countries, very similarly, and the Middle East. Virtually all of the energy ministers throughout the Middle East were educated in the United States. Engineering, finance, all of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. So before we were hoping that they would bring the seeds of democracy or to see how it works here to bring back to where they're from and maybe spread it.
Well, and to create a global web of commerce for open trade.
But in reality, that has not happened. The fact you brought up Middle East, they have become more brutal over the last 20, 30 years. Saudi Arabia we know what they are. There's no doubt, economy, we could give them as much business as we want. Maybe even China, we could be capitalistic all we want. The fact is they are not going to give women rights. They are a closed clique, tribal, backwards, Sharia law dominated. Historically, who are we to change thousands of years of history for them? And this applies to China. And this applies to what happened in Iraq and Argentina look at South America. Look at the mess there now after we put our hands in. Look at the past. Look at Vietnam. I don't know where to start. So how do we have what you are wishing for the next year about China or about anywhere in the world is what I wish for. Mm-hmm. But how do we do it? How do we even get there is the big part because you are not the majority. You travel the world. What you see is a lot more in depth than what most of Americans understand.
Sure.
So, because the fact is because the United States is in our own continent, we export it. We never really imported much. We don't need anyone. We could grow our own food. We have our own water supply. A place like Singapore, they don't even have their own water. They have to buy water from Malaysia. They have to fill up land, They're always in a survival mode.
They grow filling land and expanding into the ocean. No, yeah. But they have figured out how to do it, and they do it at a very interesting rate.
Exactly.
No,
I see the growth of Singapore is amazing, right? We'll come back to that. Because when I left Singapore when I was in 1990. And then I went back 5 years later. The last time I went back was 2 years ago. Every 10 years, 15 years I go back is amazing. Just like going to China, going to Shanghai, going to Beijing, it's a different city. Every few years you go back, there's a different city. New landmarks, new buildings, new streets. But all that doesn't cover up a lot of the problems, right? Economic advancement, right. Capitalistic. We would think it would speed up the process of what you said of having more freedom. But a lot of times it did not. In the Middle East, for sure it didn't. It actually went backwards. We condoned it. We allowed it. We thought So this is the scary part, that fine line. It's a tightrope. I don't have a solution. We're discussing this because I hope we could live peacefully. I hope we could all grow and compete and share. I hope. But how are we going to do that? How do we count with our limited influence? How can we spread that?
Well, I think we can maybe just end our program this evening on one of the things that is in very short supply around the world, and certainly in the United States, is tolerance and patience. And I think if we treat each other with respect, and if we in the United States look at, let's say, China, and there's another model that underscores the importance of the Chinese model, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, and say, we do what we do because we think it's right. You do what you do because you think it's right for you. And as long as we look at each other and we respect the difference, then and we figure out where we can work together and on other things where we need to be separate so that we don't clash, then we'll leave it alone. And so, Godspeed, you do it your way, I'll do it mine, and we'll meet in the middle, literally over the Pacific or in trade or in some other, but we don't try to enforce our will on each other. We try to take the best and we learn from each other. And trade is the most important aspect of that. Travel, all other forms of interchange. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia is no longer the leader in the Middle East. There are two leaders in the Middle East. One is Israel, and the other is the UAE.
Abu Dhabi and
Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And not far behind them are Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Okay, now
Jordanian influence.
Yeah,
Iran's influence.
And even now, coming up from a weak position is Egypt. In a lot of ways, Egypt is really the religious, even though Medina and Mecca are in Saudi Arabia, the real theology base of Islam is in Egypt. And but my point is, Dubai and the Gulf Coast states have really embraced global capitalism, and they've known how to do it extremely well. They have taken advantage of some other things globally, like they are now independent in the Middle East, as Switzerland used to be in Europe. And at any rate, a lot of things are going on, and this recent Israeli pact is incredibly powerful and will grow exponentially, and the theocracies of Saudi Arabia and Iran will gradually fall further and further behind. I don't wish them ill in any way, but my point is, and by the way, Dubai and Abu Dhabi are not democracies. They're emirates, okay? The royal families control almost everything, but they do have a rule of law, and they respect a lot of very interesting things.
Good point. Good point. But I've been to Abu Dhabi. I've been to Dubai. I have good friends living there, and I visit there and stay there for a little bit of time. Their rule of law, as an American, I was very upset. Above the gold toilets and the facade, they're still segregated. Women, minorities.
Oh,
it's Indian and Filipino workers or people that are not part of the royal family, that are not part of the Emirates. Huge. It's a caste system.
And those people will never, ever become citizens. They will never earn, there will always be guest workers. They will never earn the right.
If our world becomes that system, we're in big trouble. To me, that is one of the most backwards places I've been to.
In that respect, yes.
There's no law. I'm sorry. The law is facade. It's built for Westerners to see. I know that firsthand. You could pay anybody off. If you're the royal family, you could kill somebody on the street and nothing will happen to you. There is no law. The law only applies to the people that does not have a chance to speak. They're not empowered. And there is no way I would ever, I'm saying this because when I was there, we were there over Christmas break, family reunion from all over the world. So we had family meet up there. We were not allowed to eat in the restaurant because my mother, my sister was with us, and they're women in an upscale restaurant. They told us, just go to one of those Western hotels, eat there.
Yeah.
We got looks everywhere because we didn't cover it. Or it was just, You should hear the horror stories of people that are not natives. You should hear what people say. Even Americans that work there, you can hear the horrendous things.
My daughter lived there for 5 years.
It's fun. It is fun to be there. It is great to you see the dazzle, and it was great. But deep inside, I'd rather be in China than to live under that stuff. That's pretty strong words, right? So on that note, Jim.
But to answer your question,
yes,
we have to be tolerant of those different systems and figure out how to take best advantage of our mutual goals.
It's hard. Being Christian, there's certain fundamental things that go against what we teach our kids, right? Well, so the dilemma for me always is we have to respect the culture. We have to work together. Yeah. But then overall, to me, what is judged in the end is whether I go to heaven or hell. So in order to condone the culture, I'm going to go to hell for that. So in the end, I always have to think, what am I going to do when I'm in front of the pearly gates? How would I answer? That's why always they come down to it.
Well, maybe we should end the show before we answer that question.
There you go. Too far. We went too far. But like I said, we come back to bring it back because I always get out of the main point is it's been a difficult year. We made it so far. Next year will be just as hard with or without the virus. We have to make do. We have to do the best we can. We have to work with people. We have to have communication. Everything you said applies next year and every after. And we will.
Yeah. Well, let's we have another year to go through everything that we've deferred talking about this year. So let's commit to do it, but let's commit to do it in a positive way so that at the end, we are all better off than when we started.
Absolutely. I agree. Make lemonade out of lemons. I think that's the American way.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Let me tell our audience a little bit very quickly before we go. 我跟观众再报一个拜一个年，祝大家新年愉快，祝大家这个明年都这个大吉大利，这个所有的事情都很顺心。也希望我们这个疫情至少在美国，别的国家都 OK 了，我们这里希望我们能控制住，希望我们华人、我们中国人在全世界的地位都能够提高，希望我们能够过得更好。我们在这里也谢谢 Jim 过去这半年来，也谢谢我们所有观众一直支持我跟 Jim 的节目，也一直关注我们，希望你们大家多多转发。Please thank all our audience for supporting us for the past half year. Every week we never stopped, we never quit for 1 week. We appreciate them for following us
all the way through.
We hope our audience would send a link, invite their friends to watch, email it. It's very simple. Go to YouTube, send them out, let people know about us, and leave comments, and we'll answer them.
Yeah.
Jim is
Send their questions, send their requests, all those kinds of things. As we end, my Jewish friends have a favorite farewell, and they say, next year in Jerusalem, where our worldwide family will come together in Jerusalem. For us, next year on our television show right here, all over again.
Very, very nice, Jim. Thank you so much. And Jim, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and your family. Jimmy.
Good night. Bye-bye.